May 15, 1940, a crossroads outside Arras, northern France. Private Tommy Atkins crouches behind a low stone wall, watching a Panzer III grind towards his position. The tank's tracks chew through the spring wheat, its 37mm gun sweeping left and right. In his hands, Atkins clutches what looks like a drainpipe welded to a stick. His section commander had called it the boys' anti-tank rifle when they'd collected them from stores 3 months earlier. Everyone else called it something far less printable. At 1.6 meters long and weighing 16 kilograms, it was an absolute bastard to carry. It kicked like a mule. The recoil had broken Jenkins' collarbone during training. And now, as German armour pours across France, Atkins is expected to stop a 20-ton steel monster with this Heath Robinson contraption. He slides the massive .55 caliber round into the breech. The Panzer is 200 meters away. 150. He aims for the driver's vision port. 100 meters. His finger tightens on the trigger. The weapon erupts. The recoil slams into his shoulder like a sledgehammer. Through the smoke, he sees the tank slew to the left, grinding to a halt. The shot has penetrated. This ridiculous-looking pipe on a stick has just knocked out a German tank. What happened next would reshape how the British Army thought about portable anti-tank warfare for the next 5 years. The problem Britain faced in 1940 was brutally simple. The German Blitzkrieg doctrine had turned tanks from lumbering support vehicles into the spearhead of modern warfare. Poland had fallen in weeks, France was collapsing, and British infantry had essentially nothing that could stop armoured vehicles. The standard-issue rifle fired a .303 round that bounced off tank plating like raindrops. Anti-tank guns existed, but they were heavy, required vehicles to move, and took precious minutes to deploy. By the time you'd manhandled a 2-pounder into position, the Panzers had already overrun your position. The mathematics were terrifying. A German armoured division could advance 50 kilometres in a single day. British infantry marched at 5 kilometres per hour. You couldn't retreat faster than the enemy could advance. You couldn't hide from something that could simply drive through your concealment. The War Office's own assessments from May 1940 make for grim reading. One report noted that British infantry companies in France were essentially defenceless against armoured attack. Another calculated that without man-portable anti-tank weapons, casualties during German armoured breakthroughs would reach 40% within the first hour of contact. That wasn't acceptable loss, that was annihilation. The British Army needed something infantry could actually carry, something that could penetrate German armour, and something that could be produced quickly enough to matter. How do you give a single soldier the hitting power to destroy a machine specifically designed to be indestructible? The answer came from the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock, North London, and from a designer named Captain Henry Boys. Development had actually begun in 1934, when the Ordnance Board recognised that future conflicts would involve more armoured vehicles. Boys and his team approached the problem with typical British pragmatism. If you couldn't make the gun smaller, you made the bullet bigger, much bigger. The Boys anti-tank rifle fired a .55 caliber round, officially designated the .55 Boys. To put that in perspective, a standard rifle round is 7.7 millimeters across. The Boys round was 13.9 millimeters. It was 5 times heavier. The cartridge case alone was 99 millimeters long, roughly the length of a mobile phone. The complete round weighed 60 grams, compared to 11 grams for a standard rifle round. This wasn't just scaling up. This was creating something entirely new. The projectile was a hardened steel core wrapped in a copper driving band, designed to punch through armour plate using kinetic energy alone. No explosive, no shaped charge, just physics and metallurgy. The barrel itself was a masterpiece of precision engineering. It featured 5 grooves with a right-hand twist, 1 turn in 30 inches to stabilise the massive projectile in flight. The barrel was chromium-plated inside to handle the extreme pressures generated when firing. Peak chamber pressure reached 20 tons per square inch. That's roughly equivalent to the pressure 200 meters underwater. To handle the recoil, boys incorporated a brilliant solution. The barrel wasn't fixed to the receiver. Instead, it was mounted on rails that allowed it to slide backwards when fired, with a massive spring absorbing the energy. The circular muzzle brake at the front redirected propellant gases to further reduce felt recoil. Even with these innovations, firing the boys was famously unpleasant. Shooters described it as being kicked by a horse. The padded shoulder rest helped, but nothing could eliminate the fundamental physics. Newton's third law doesn't negotiate. Manufacturing began in 1937 at Enfield, with additional production at Birmingham Small Arms and Standard Motors in Coventry. The British also shipped components to Canada, where John Inglis and Company in Toronto produced approximately 7,000 units. Total production figures remain somewhat uncertain due to wartime record keeping, but estimates suggest around 62,000 boys' rifles were manufactured between 1937 and 1943. Each rifle cost approximately £15 to produce, equivalent to 3 months' wages for a factory worker. The rifles were issued at a scale of 1 per infantry platoon, giving each 30-man unit at least some anti-tank capability. In combat, the boys' anti-tank rifle proved far more effective than its ungainly appearance suggested. During the Battle of France, British and French forces used boys' rifles with considerable success against early model Panzers. The .55 round could penetrate 21 millimeters of armour at 100 meters, more than sufficient to defeat the Panzer I and Panzer II. Even the heavier Panzer III, with 30 millimeters frontal armour, was vulnerable at closer ranges if struck at the right angle. The key was hitting vision ports, track assemblies, or thinner side armour. Records from the British Expeditionary Force note multiple instances of boys' rifles disabling or destroying German tanks during the Arras counterattack in May 1940. The psychological impact was substantial. German tank crews had become accustomed to near invulnerability against infantry. The sudden appearance of a weapon that could actually harm them forced tactical changes. Tanks began advancing more cautiously, maintaining greater distance from suspected infantry positions. The boys' rifle also saw extensive use in North Africa, where the open terrain and longer engagement ranges suited its capabilities. Commonwealth forces, particularly Australian and New Zealand units, became particularly adept with the weapon. During the Siege of Tobruk in 1941, Australian defenders used boys' rifles against Italian light tanks with devastating effect. The rifle's armour-piercing rounds could punch clean through the 14mm armour of Italian L3 tankettes. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Germans, interestingly, never developed a direct equivalent to the boys. They relied instead on the Panzerbüchse 38 and 39, chambered for 7.92 by 94mm ammunition. The German rounds were smaller and less powerful than the British .55, capable of penetrating only 13mm of armour at 100 meters compared to the boys' 21mm. The Germans compensated somewhat with tungsten cord rounds, but these were expensive and remained in short supply throughout the war. The Americans took a different approach entirely with their .50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun, which could fire armour-piercing rounds, but lacked the boys' penetration at typical engagement ranges. The Soviets developed the PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles, firing 14.5 by 114mm rounds. These weapons were simpler, lighter, and arguably more reliable than the boys, but arrived later in the war, when tank armour had already increased beyond what any rifle-caliber weapon could defeat. What made the boys distinctly British was its mechanical sophistication. The sliding barrel, the precision muzzle brake, the carefully calculated recoil system, these weren't the products of rushed wartime improvisation. They represented considered engineering applied to an urgent military requirement. The French also adopted the boys, purchasing several thousand rifles in 1939 and 1940. After the fall of France, Free French forces continued using captured British stocks throughout the war. The boys' anti-tank rifles' impact on the Second World War is difficult to quantify precisely. It didn't win battles single-handedly. It didn't halt the German advance through France. But it gave British infantry something they desperately needed: the ability to fight back against armour. The weapon's presence forced German tactical adjustments. Tanks couldn't operate with impunity near infantry positions. They had to maintain distance, move more cautiously, coordinate more closely with supporting infantry. These adjustments slowed the tempo of German advances. By 1942, tank armour had increased beyond what the boys could reliably penetrate. The Panzer IV's 50mm frontal armour was essentially immune to .55 rounds at combat ranges. The British response was the Piat, which used a spring-loaded spigot to launch a shaped charge warhead. The Piat was shorter, lighter, and far more effective against late-war armour. Boys' rifles were gradually withdrawn from frontline service, though they remained in use for special purposes. The rifles found new life as sniper weapons in the Far East, where their tremendous power made them effective against Japanese bunkers and light fortifications. Canadian forces used boys' rifles for airfield defence throughout the war. Surviving examples can be seen at the Imperial War Museum in London, the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and the Royal Armouries at Fort Nelson. Return to that crossroads outside Arras in May 1940. Private Atkins watches the disabled Panzer through his sights. The tank isn't destroyed. His round penetrated the driver's compartment, but the vehicle could probably be recovered and repaired. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it's stopped. The German advance at this point, on this road, has been delayed. Minutes become hours. Hours become days. Days allow other units to withdraw, to reorganise, to prepare new defensive positions. This is how wars are actually fought, not through miracle weapons or decisive wonder technologies, but through incremental advantages that accumulate over time. The boys' anti-tank rifle was never going to single-handedly defeat the Wehrmacht. It was heavy, awkward, unpleasant to fire, and quickly outclassed by improving tank armour. But for 3 critical years, it gave British infantry a weapon that actually worked. That deserves remembering. In the desperate days of 1940 and 1941, when Britain faced potential invasion and Commonwealth forces fought against overwhelming odds in North Africa, the ridiculous-looking pipe on a stick proved it could bite. German tank commanders learned to respect the distinctive crack of a boy's rifle. They learned that British infantry positions weren't defenceless after all. They learned to advance more cautiously, to maintain greater distance, to treat every hedgerow and every stone wall as potentially lethal. The boys' anti-tank rifle taught the German army a lesson they'd been teaching everyone else for the first year of the war: underestimate your enemy's capabilities at your peril. What looks stupid might just kill you.